I'm going to go down there and work on another book.
What are you writing now?
It's kind of under wraps because I talked about this book way too much and it slowed me down.
Is it all about Neil Young's bed?
Can we cut that out? I can get a guy in trouble for saying that. You remember the first time I was on this show, how fucked up it was at the beginning? Were you even aware of that?
What happened?
So the first time I came on the show, I didn't know you, right? And I didn't know anything about you because I was living in Spain. And Duncan, I had done Duncan shows. The first time I'd done I didn't know what a podcast was. I came to LA to visit my parents. I had this email from Duncan. I'm a comedian. You want to do a podcast? I'm like, sure. Never met a comedian. Don't know what a podcast is. So I did it, and we had a good time. And after, he's like, I'd love to introduce you to my friend Joe Rogan. I think you guys would get along, and you could do his podcast. I'd never heard of Joe Rogan. Right? And no insult intended. I lived in Spain. I did never watch Fear Factor. Your whole thing was happening over here. I didn't know about it. And then I went back to Spain. I was like, okay, Duncan's friend Joe does this podcast in his living room the way Duncan does, I assumed, right? And I went back to Spain and I was talking to my buddy Voodoo, who's a tattoo artist. And he's like, so how was LA? I was like, yeah, cool. I did a podcast with this comedian. It was really fun and interesting. And he's like, oh, you should do Joe Rogan's podcast. I'm like, dude, how do you know Duncan's friend Joe? Right? It was this whole weird thing. He's like, no, dude, Joe Rogan's. So I tried to tell you that story the first time I came. And the point of the story is I'm an idiot. I don't know what's going on, right? I'm oblivious. But we got to the point where I said I didn't know you. And you were like, so what'd you do? Google me? And I was like, well, not really. And then we had to do a sound check, or you had to do an ad or something, and the story got interrupted, and I felt like you thought I was trying to diss you or something.
Yeah, I definitely didn't.
Yeah, well, I was paranoid. Then you lit up a joint. And you pass the joint around,
paranoia.
And I'm like, fuck, if I don't hit this joint, then I'm confirmed asshole here. So I hit the joint even though I hadn't smoked any weed in months. And it was this like California weed. I'm holding, literally, I remember, I'm holding the bottom of my chair, trying not to fall out of the chair. And we start talking, and I'm telling the story about a dude that I'd met on an airplane. And he was super into Sex at Dawn, and then we were going to do a movie together and whatever. And then his wife like took the book away from him.
Yeah.
Do you remember all that?
Yeah.
And then I was just like, oh fuck, I shouldn't have told that story. That this whole I'm fucking everything up. And I said to you, can we just, because we're like 5 minutes in at this point, and I was like, Joe, can we just like cut this and start over? And you looked at me and you said, it's live, bitch. You don't remember any of that?
I do now. Yeah, I do now.
Oh man,
I knew the guy. I knew the guy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And you were like, say his name, and then I said his name. You're like, no, he's a friend of mine, and I'm like, oh shit, I should have said his name and the whole thing. Yeah, and then I left. Casilda was here in the studio, and we left. We got in the car, and I said, man, was that as awkward as I felt? And she's like, that's the worst I've ever seen you.
You were great.
Oh shit!
Established a great friendship.
Yeah.
No issues at all.
I don't know. Maybe you enjoyed watching me suffer. I don't know.
I do enjoy watching people get too high. It's not a suffer thing. It's like I've been there. It's a commiseration thing, I think. One of the things about these sober October things is you realize like there's so many things that are so much easier when you're not high.
Yeah.
You know, it's almost like you handicap yourself by getting baked. Like, I was talking to Brian Redband about this. Like, we were talking about like how the early days of podcast, we would get obliterated before we would do the podcast. Like, for years, like up until like maybe 2013 or 14, like we would, I had a Volcano. Do you know what that is? Those vaporizers. It fills up this bag. And you take these big, deep hits off this THC vapor, and then as soon as you put the bag down and we're like, okay, let's get going, let's start the podcast, and be like, oh my God, what have we done? And it was this feeling every time we did the podcast was, oh my God, what have we done? And you'd be in the middle of saying something, and as you were saying, you're like, what am I talking about?
Yeah.
I don't even know what I'm talking about. And then you would say, oh, no, it's not that. Like, you would screw things up. You get scrambled in your head. When there's no pot at all, that never happens. Like, you might make mistakes, but you know what you're talking about while you're talking about it.
Right.
Like, when you're really, really high like that, there's a lot of times where you're talking about stuff where you literally don't know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. It's like that split personality thing we were talking about earlier.
Marijuana has so many pros, but it's got some cons, like everything in life, like love and good things and bad things and food and sleep. There's pros and cons, and then the cons become very evident when you're not doing it. You know, and I still think every time I do these Sober October things, I always think, well, I'm going to cut back. I'm going to cut back on some weed. And I think I did last year. Like, after October, I was like, I am not going to do it as much as I used to.
Thank you for watching, guys. Please like and subscribe.